The subway car hummed with the usual symphony of city life, the rhythmic clatter of steel wheels on tracks, snippets of conversation, and the occasional ding of a cell phone notification. It was just another evening in the city, a mix of commuters, families, and the occasional lone traveler lost in thought or a book. The air carried the faint scent of coffee and worn leather, blending with the metallic tang of the subway's machinery. For most, it was just another ride home. But for one off-duty Marine, it was about to become anything but ordinary. Sitting near the corner of the car, the Marine wasn't particularly noticeable at first glance. He wasn't in uniform, after all. Just another guy in a plain jacket, sturdy boots, and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. His sharp gaze, however, missed nothing. He'd always been that way, ever since his time in the Corps, trained to assess, observe, and react. Old habits die hard, even when you're just trying to blend in. Across from him sat a young mother, her little boy perched beside her with a coloring book and a box of crayons. The boy was humming a tune under his breath, occasionally stopping to show his mom a scribble or two. She would smile, nod, and go back to scrolling through her phone. It was a scene so ordinary that no one paid much attention except to admire, maybe, the innocence of childhood. But someone else was paying attention. Someone whose intentions weren't so innocent. A man, standing just a few feet away, had been watching them closely. Too closely. He shifted from foot to foot, his eyes darting between the mother and her child like a predator sizing up prey. His hands were buried deep in his pockets, and his stance radiated a nervous energy that seemed out of place amidst the usual subway bustle. The Marine noticed him almost immediately. Years of experience had taught him to trust his gut, and right now, his instincts were screaming that something wasn't right. The man made his first move when the subway car jolted to a stop. He edged closer to the child, using the momentary chaos as cover. His steps were deliberate, but his expression tried to mask it a forced casualness that didn't fool the Marine one bit. He tensed, his mind racing through scenarios. Was this guy going to snatch the kid? Start trouble? Or was it all just a misunderstanding? The Marine wasn't about to wait to find out. As the doors slid open at the next station, the man suddenly lunged forward, his hand reaching for the boy's arm. It happened so fast that most of the passengers didn't even register what was happening. The mother gasped, frozen in shock. The boy yelped, his crayon box tumbling to the floor. And that's when the Marine moved. He was on his feet in an instant, crossing the space between them faster than anyone could react. Grabbing the man's arm mid-lunge, the Marine yanked him back with a force that sent both of them stumbling. The mother pulled her child close, her wide eyes darting between the two men as the subway doors began to close. "Let him go," the Marine growled, his voice low but firm. It wasn't loud, but it carried the kind of weight that stopped people in their tracks. The man hesitated, his eyes flicking around the car as if searching for an escape route. Passengers began to stir now, whispers rippling through the crowd. Some pulled out their phones, recording the confrontation, while others shrank back, unsure of what to do. The subway car was alive with tension, every eye fixed on the two men locked in a silent standoff. The Marine tightened his grip, his muscles coiled like a spring. He didn't want to escalate things, but he wasn't about to let this guy walk away, not without answers. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice calm but laced with steel. "What do you think you're doing?" The man's mouth opened, then closed again, like a fish out of water. For a moment, it seemed like he might try to run. But the Marine's unyielding presence left him nowhere to go. The subway car rocked as it picked up speed, the lights flickering briefly. And in that suspended moment, the Marine made a decision, one that would either diffuse the situation or escalate it to a breaking point. What happened next would change the lives of everyone in that subway car. The subway car seemed to hold its breath, the usual noise and chatter replaced by an eerie, tense silence. All eyes were on the Marine and the man whose intentions had just been called into question. The child clung to his mother, burying his face in her coat as she whispered reassurances. Her voice was trembling, though she tried to stay calm. Everyone else sat frozen, unsure whether to intervene or let the Marine handle it. The man's body stiffened under the Marine's firm grip. He stammered something incomprehensible, his words spilling out in broken fragments. I wasn't. I didn't mean to. His eyes darted around, looking for an escape, but the Marine's grip held him in place like a steel trap. You've got 3 seconds to explain yourself, the Marine said, his tone low and deliberate. And I suggest you make it good. The man swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He tried to step back, but there was nowhere to go. I thought it was my nephew, he blurted out finally, his voice shaking. I swear. He looks just like my sister's kid. The Marine's sharp gaze didn't waver. He could tell the man was lying. His story was flimsy at best, and the panic in his eyes betrayed him. But the Marine also knew better than to escalate things without concrete evidence. The subway car was still moving, the next station a couple of minutes away. If he made the wrong call, the situation could spiral out of control fast. The other passengers started murmuring among themselves, some pulling their phones closer to their faces to record more discreetly. A man in a business suit whispered to the person beside him, while a teenager sitting by the door craned his neck to get a better view. The mother, still clutching her son, finally spoke up, her voice trembling but resolute. That's not true, she said, glaring at the man. We've never seen you before in our lives. The Marine glanced at her, reading the fear and fury in her expression. That was all he needed to confirm his suspicions. Turning his attention back to the man, he tightened his grip slightly, just enough to keep him from trying anything stupid. Here's what's going to happen, the Marine said, his voice steady and commanding. You're going to stay right here until we get to the next station. Then we're going to let the authorities sort this out. Got it? The man's face turned pale, but he didn't argue. He nodded quickly, beads of sweat forming on his brow. The Marine wasn't sure if he'd comply, but for now, he wasn't taking any chances. The subway car rattled as it sped through the underground tunnel. The Marine could feel the tension radiating from the passengers around him. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. Some were nervous, others angry, and a few seemed almost eager, like they were watching a live drama unfold. In those brief, tense moments, the Marine's mind raced. He didn't know much about the man he was holding, but he knew enough to be cautious. Was this guy working alone? Was there someone else in the car waiting for an opportunity to act? His eyes scanned the other passengers, searching for anything that seemed out of place. A tall man in the corner avoided eye contact, but his posture didn't suggest immediate danger. A woman holding a shopping bag glanced nervously between the Marine and the man, clutching her purse tighter. The Marine's instincts told him to stay alert. Every muscle in his body was primed, ready to react at a moment's notice. He wasn't just protecting the child anymore, he was protecting everyone in the car. The subway began to slow. As it approached the next station, the familiar ding signaling the stop. The Marine shifted his stance, preparing for what might come next. He had no idea if the man would make a break for it, or if the authorities would even arrive in time. But one thing was clear, he wasn't letting this guy out of his sight. As the train came to a halt, the doors slid open with a mechanical hiss. A handful of passengers hurried off, some throwing nervous glances back at the scene. Others lingered, curious to see how it would play out. The Marine kept his grip firm, his eyes locked on the man. Then, from the corner of his vision, he saw movement quick and deliberate. A second man, who'd been sitting quietly near the door, suddenly stood up and moved toward them. The Marine's body tensed. Was this an accomplice? A witness stepping in? Or something else entirely? Before the Marine could react, the second man raised his hands, palms out. Hey, I don't want any trouble, he said, his voice calm but urgent. But I think you should hear me out. The Marine studied him carefully. The man appeared harmless, mid-30s, dressed casually, with a messenger bag slung over one shoulder. His expression was serious, but not threatening. What do you know? The Marine asked, not loosening his grip on the first man. The second man hesitated, glancing at the nervous passengers around them. I've seen this guy before, he said, nodding toward the man in the Marine's grasp. A few weeks ago, at another station, he was following another family, same setup, a mom and her kid. I thought it was weird, but I didn't say anything at the time. The Marine's jaw tightened. If what this man was saying was true, then this wasn't some random misunderstanding. It was a pattern. A dangerous one. The first man's eyes widened, and he began to stammer again. No, that's not true. I don't even know this guy. But the Marine didn't buy it. His grip remained firm as he addressed the second man. You're sure about this? Positive, the man replied. I remember his face. It stuck with me because it didn't feel right. The tension in the subway car thickened as the implications of his words sank in. The Marine's mind raced, weighing his options. He needed to act fast, but he also needed to keep everyone safe. The tension in the subway car was suffocating, every passenger holding their breath as the Marine maintained his grip on the man. The second man's revelation had changed everything. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was a pattern, and the stakes were higher than anyone realized. The subway's intercom crackled to life, announcing the next station. The Marine's mind worked rapidly. He needed to ensure the authorities were involved, but he also couldn't risk this man making a move before then. He glanced at the other passengers, some still recording with their phones, others frozen in uncertainty. As the train slowed to a stop, the first man's demeanor shifted. His stammering pleas suddenly gave way to a cold, calculating calm. The Marine recognized it instantly. It was the look of someone who had been cornered but wasn't done fighting yet. Look, the man said, his voice now eerily steady. You don't know what you're doing. Let me go, and we'll all walk away from this. No one has to get hurt. The Marine's jaw tightened. You've already crossed a line, he replied, his voice steady. You're not going anywhere. The subway doors slid open, and the platform buzzed with activity. Several passengers bolted out, eager to escape the unfolding drama. But the Marine didn't move, keeping his hold firm. He scanned the platform, searching for any sign of law enforcement. To his relief, 2 transit officers were making their way toward the car, their uniforms cutting through the crowd. Oh, we're here, a passenger shouted, waving them down. The officers quickened their pace, stepping onto the train with practiced authority. What's going on here? One of them asked, his hand resting on the radio at his hip. The Marine quickly explained the situation, detailing the man's actions and the second passenger's testimony. The officers listened intently, their eyes narrowing as they took in the trembling mother and her frightened child. But just as one officer reached for the man, he made his move. With a sudden burst of energy, he twisted out of the Marine's grip, shoving past the officer and bolting toward the open doors. Gasps erupted from the passengers, and the Marine's instincts kicked in. He lunged forward, grabbing the man's arm just as he reached the platform. They struggled briefly, but the Marine's strength won out, pinning the man against the subway door. You're not running this time? The Marine said, his voice low and resolute. The officers moved in quickly, cuffing the man and leading him off the train. The crowd on the platform parted, a mix of relief and unease spreading through the onlookers. The mother hugged her son tightly, tears streaming down her face as she whispered words of comfort. As the adrenaline began to fade, the Marine stepped back, catching his breath. He watched as the officers led the man away, their radios crackling with updates. But just as he was about to turn back to his seat, the second man, the one who had spoken up, approached him. Hey, the man said quietly, his eyes darting to the commotion outside. Thanks for stepping in. You probably saved that kid. The Marine nodded, his expression thoughtful. What made you speak up? He asked. Most people wouldn't. The man hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. I've seen something like this before. A long time ago. I didn't do anything then, and I've regretted it ever since. There was a heaviness in his voice that the Marine didn't miss. He nodded again, understanding more than he let on. You did the right thing today, he said. The second man gave a faint smile before stepping off the train. The platform doors closed, and the subway began to move again, leaving the chaos behind. For a moment, the car was silent. Then, as the tension slowly dissolved, a few passengers began to clap. It started small but grew louder, spreading through the car until nearly everyone was applauding. The Marine, still standing near the door, looked around, slightly taken aback. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, but he nodded in acknowledgement, his expression humble. As the train continued down the line, the mother approached him, her son still clinging to her side. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what would have happened if you weren't here." The Marine shook his head. "Just glad I could help," he replied. "You take care of him, okay?" She nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. The little boy looked up at the Marine, his small voice breaking the quiet. "Are you a superhero?" The Marine chuckled, crouching down to meet the boy's gaze. "No, buddy. Just someone who cares." As the subway approached the next station, the Marine finally took his seat, leaning back against the cold metal. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving him tired but strangely at peace. He didn't know what would happen next, what the man's story was, or if justice would truly be served, but he knew he'd done the right thing. And sometimes, that was enough. But just as the train pulled into the next station, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Pulling it out, he frowned at the unfamiliar number. He almost didn't answer, but decided to pick up at the last second. "Hello?" he said. There was a pause, and then a voice on the other end spoke, a voice that sent a chill down his spine. "We know what you did," the voice said, calm and measured. "And this isn't over." The line went dead, leaving the Marine staring at his phone as the train doors opened once again. The story wasn't over after all. The Marine sat frozen in his seat, the phone still in his hand, the words echoing in his mind. "We know what you did." The call was brief, yet it carried a weight that felt like a stone in his chest. He scanned the subway car, his eyes darting from face to face, searching for anything unusual. But the passengers around him seemed preoccupied, either scrolling on their phones or staring blankly at the advertisements above the seats. Whoever had called him wasn't here, or, if they were, they weren't giving themselves away. The train rattled on, the hum of the tracks filling the silence. He slipped the phone back into his pocket, leaning back in his seat, his thoughts racing. Was it a bluff? A scare tactic? Or was there something bigger at play? He replayed the events of the last hour in his mind, the man's actions, the second witness stepping forward, the arrest. It all felt too chaotic to be part of some grand plan, but the call made him second-guess everything. As the subway reached its final stop, he stood and adjusted his jacket, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. He stepped onto the platform, the cool air of the underground station hitting his face. The crowd thinned out as people made their way to the exits, leaving him alone in the dimly lit space. He hesitated for a moment, then headed toward the stairs, his senses heightened with every step. Once outside, the city greeted him with its usual chaos, honking cars, distant sirens, and the chatter of people rushing to their destinations. It was comforting in a way, the normalcy of it all. He pulled his phone out again and checked the number that had called him. It was unlisted, no way to trace it back to anyone. For now, he decided to push it to the back of his mind. He had done what he could, and the authorities were handling the rest. At least, that's what he told himself. The following day, he received a call from the police. The man arrested on the subway had a history of similar incidents, though none had escalated to the level of attempted abduction. Several families had come forward with stories of being followed or harassed, but there hadn't been enough evidence to press charges until now. The Marine's intervention had been the turning point, giving the authorities what they needed to dig deeper. The officer on the phone thanked him for his quick thinking and assured him that the case was in good hands. It was a small relief, but the unease from the mysterious call lingered. He didn't mention it to the police, unsure if it was even worth bringing up. For now, he decided to let it go. Weeks passed, and life returned to a semblance of normal. The Marine went about his days, volunteering at a local community center and helping train young recruits at a nearby gym. He tried to put the subway incident behind him, though it wasn't easy. He often thought of the mother and her child, wondering how they were doing and whether they'd been able to move past the fear of that night. He hoped they had. Then one evening, as he was locking up the gym, he noticed a car parked across the street. It wasn't unusual, this was a busy area, but something about it caught his attention. The engine was off, and the driver's silhouette was barely visible in the dim light. He lingered for a moment, pretending to check his phone, but the car didn't move. Finally, he shrugged it off, chalking it up to paranoia, and headed home. The next day, the same car was parked outside the community center where he volunteered. This time, he didn't ignore it. He crossed the street and walked past the vehicle, his eyes discreetly scanning for details. The windows were tinted, and the plates were partially obscured by dirt, making it hard to see anything clearly. But as he passed, he caught a faint movement inside someone shifting in their seat, trying not to be noticed. He kept walking, his pulse quickening. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone was watching him. That night, as he sat in his small apartment, he thought about his options. He could report it to the police, but without concrete evidence, there wasn't much they could do. He considered confronting whoever was in the car, but that carried its own risks. Instead, he decided to wait and see if they made another move. If they did, he'd be ready. Days turned into a week, and the car stopped appearing. Just as he began to relax, a letter arrived at his door. It was unmarked, no return address, and inside was a single sheet of paper with 4 words, "This isn't over yet." He stared at the note, a mix of anger and determination washing over him. Whoever was behind this wanted him to be afraid, but he refused to give them that power. He'd faced worse threats before, and he wasn't about to back down now. The next morning, he took the letter to the police. This time, they took him seriously, opening an investigation and assigning an officer to keep an eye on him. It wasn't much, but it was a start. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he wasn't handling this alone. As the investigation unfolded, a clearer picture began to emerge. The man from the subway wasn't acting alone. He was part of a small network involved in illegal activities targeting vulnerable families in crowded areas. The Marines' intervention had disrupted their plans, and now they were trying to intimidate him into silence. The police assured him they were closing in on the group, but the Marine wasn't content to sit back and wait. He began working with the officers, sharing details from that night on the subway, and even helping identify potential suspects. His military training proved invaluable, giving the authorities insights they wouldn't have had otherwise. Finally, after weeks of surveillance and coordination, the police made several arrests, dismantling the network and ensuring they wouldn't harm anyone else. The Marine felt a weight lift from his shoulders, knowing the threat was over. The case had consumed his life for months, but now, standing on the other side of it, he felt a deep sense of purpose. Reflecting on everything, he realized that moment on the subway had been more than just a split-second decision. It was a reminder of the importance of stepping up, even when it's inconvenient or dangerous. He hadn't just saved one child, he'd helped prevent countless others from becoming victims. In the end, life returned to its steady rhythm. The Marine continued his work at the community center and gym, but now with a renewed sense of mission. He knew the world wasn't perfect, but he also knew the power of ordinary people standing up for what's right. And if he'd learned anything, it was that one moment of courage could change everything. The subway incident became a story passed around the neighborhood, inspiring others to be vigilant and to speak up when something didn't feel right. The Marine didn't seek recognition or praise, content to let the impact of his actions speak for itself. One quiet evening, months later, he received a letter in the mail. This time, it wasn't a threat. It was from the mother whose child he had saved. Inside was a heartfelt note, thanking him for his bravery and for giving her son a chance to grow up in a safer world. At the bottom of the letter, the boy had drawn a picture of a man in a baseball cap, standing tall and proud. The Marine smiled, folding the letter carefully and tucking it away. It was a small reminder of why he'd done what he did and why, if ever faced with a choice like that again, he'd do it all over.